After Conor Benn's emphatic win over Chris Eubank Jr. in their rematch, there really only remains one question as to what he will do next. Can he get himself back down to the welterweight division? Is it possible for him to ever again weigh in at 147 pounds? It's something that he hasn't been able to do since April 2022 against Chris Van Heerden. That was of course before his original fight with Chris Eubank Jr. was cancelled, as he failed that drugs test and had to spend a bit of time out of the ring. But in this video, I'm going to try to figure out whether he can get back down to that division, because seemingly that's where the most opportunity for him is, some of the most winnable fights for the highest reward. And even though he's been fighting up at middleweight for the last couple of fights, just how close he might already be to being a welterweight might just surprise you. Hello everyone, and welcome back to A Guy Called Henry. I hope you all had a fantastic weekend, and I hope you enjoyed the boxing. So in this video, I'm going to be trying to figure out some details about Conor Benn's weight. I've been really digging around, doing my research, and I've got some really interesting information for you all. For those of you that are new, this channel is all about boxing analysis, breakdowns, tactical analysis, all that great stuff. So don't forget to subscribe if you're new, don't forget to bang a like on the video if you like it, and make sure you get your comments in the comment section below. Now to begin, there is definitely a sense of irony in talking about this, because we've just had this massive drama around Eubank Jr. in his fights with Conor Benn, with the rehydration clauses, with the fact that he probably shouldn't have been at 160 pounds anymore. And now perhaps we're about to see what it looks like when the shoe is on the other foot. There are discussions about Conor Benn going back down to welterweight, a weight that he'd only ever fought at before this whole Chris Eubank Jr. debacle. And people are now suggesting that it might not be a weight he can do anymore because he's got bigger. Funny how that happens as you get older. Funny how that can happen when you move up in weight. But anyway, we all know that this can be a dangerous thing, going up in weight and then coming back down again. There are many cautionary tales. To name a few, Oscar De La Hoya when he fought Manny Pacquiao and got absolutely destroyed by the smaller man. Oscar De La Hoya had previously fought at welterweight, but it had been 7 years since he'd made the weight. It was clearly dangerous, he was clearly drained, and he got absolutely dismantled by what at the time was a frightening Manny Pacquiao. Roy Jones Jr., when he went all the way from 193 pounds against John Ruiz back down to 175 to fight Tarver. Now, he initially got the win in their first fight, but then he got knocked out after that, and he never quite looked the same. And the one that remains most fresh in my memory is when Kell Brook went up to fight Triple G Gennady Golovkin, having always found welterweight fairly tricky to make. He went up to 160, fought Triple G, came back down, and he got stopped by Errol Spence Jr. It was the whole eye socket debacle the other one went. The whole thing was pretty traumatic if you were a Kell Brook fan, as I was at the time. So you've got to be really, really careful with these things. And the point is that just because you've once made a weight in your career, it doesn't mean that that's where you should be anymore. So what is the situation for Conor Benn? Well, as I say, up until April 2022, he was a welterweight. He weighed 146.5 pounds when he fought against Chris Van Heerden. And at the time, this is how Eddie Hearn described Conor Benn as a welterweight.
Chris Van Heerden, big guy in good shape.
Huge. I mean, look, Conor's a decent-sized welterweight. Not a huge welterweight, but Van Heerden is a huge welterweight.
So there you hear it. Eddie Hearn says he's not the biggest. He's just a normal-sized welterweight, potentially even a little bit small is kind of the insinuation, given the massive size of Chris Van Heerden in the ring. And interestingly, I found this tweet from Conor Benn. This is from all the way back in 2014. Conor Benn is 29 now, so 11 years ago, he would have been around about 18 years old. And he didn't even turn pro for 5 years after this, but when asked, what weight will you be, he said, I'm going to be a middleweight. Now look, there's a couple things you can read into this. One is that obviously his dad fought at middleweight, so he'd have been thinking, I want to be like my dad, I'm 18, I'm probably going to grow into my size, end up being a middleweight like my dad was. Perhaps he just simply held ambitions to be the same size as his dad. I'm sure as guys, we can all relate to that. But the fact is there was some belief there that he would be one. Now that also could have been based on the size he was at that time and how he felt he was going to grow into himself. And maybe that tweet in itself doesn't give us evidence of anything, but it did help me to go down this path and try to figure out how big Conor Benn actually is. Now I'm going to start with the two most recent Chris Eubank Jr. fights, because then we can understand what the task might look like to get back to welterweight and what the reality of the situation here is. Now, for the first Chris Eubank Jr. fight back in April of 2025, the weight limit for these fights was obviously 160 pounds, and for fight one, Conor Benn weighed in at 156.5 pounds. Now, I found that very strange at the time. The reason for this being that they had the rehydration clause in place, so the next day they had to be weighed again and put on no more than 10 pounds on top of 160, so 170. And Conor Benn weighed in at an even 165 pounds. Once you've rehydrated, if you're weighing in at 165 pounds, it makes absolutely no sense that you wouldn't just weigh in as close to 160 as possible the day before the fight. I really don't get why he'd cut as much water weight as he had, and it had to be water because why the hell else was there such a massive gap in your weight overnight? It wouldn't have been muscle, it wouldn't have been fat, that's for sure. Maybe a bit of food, but still, it's really weird that he would have put on that much weight and been that far under 160 when he was actually weighing over 160 the next day, so very strange. But that's a good point to make because for Fight 2, there's been this narrative that Conor Benn was bigger and stronger this time around. And I feel that that's up for debate. The first reason for that is because that whilst he weighed in a little bit heavier on the scales for the second fight, he weighed 159.25 pounds this time, so much closer to the 160 limit. As I've just expressed to you, that could have just been because he hadn't cut as much water weight. Because on the day 2 weigh-in this time, on the morning of the fight, the check weight, whatever you want to call it, he weighed 167.25 pounds, so 2.25 pounds heavier than he did at the time of the first fight. So it could just be that he actually was a bit bigger this time. It could be that he just rehydrated a little bit better, but it could also just be that Eubank Jr. was so bloody weak in there that it made Conor Benn look a lot more powerful and stronger versus the first fight. Also, the fact he wasn't flailing about quite so much, he wasn't quite so reckless as he was in the first fight. He just seemed stronger and more composed. So all this would lead us to believe that he is now a much bigger fighter than he was when he was fighting down at 147 pounds. But perhaps there was a little bit more to that Benn tweet when he was an 18-year-old that he would one day be a middleweight than initially met the eye when he was fighting at welterweight. Perhaps as a welterweight, he was actually quite a bit bigger than we thought. And I think the key to answering this comes from a fight he had back in February of 2024 when he fought one Peter Dobson. Now, this was his second comeback fight from the drug ban that he had. And in the fight previous to this, he'd fought at the 154-pound limit against Rodolfo Orozco. And that fight was only a few months before in the September. So you're looking at like a 4 or 5 month gap. Now, this Dobson fight was fought at a catch weight of 150.5 pounds. And both of these guys made the weight. At least they both weighed in at 150.5. The actual catch weight might have been 151 or 152. I can't find exactly what it was, but that's the main point is they weighed in at 150.5 each. But then I managed to find this. A key detail in finding out just how big Conor Benn actually is, or potentially was as a welterweight. And you can see here, on the morning of the fight, after he's weighed in and after he's rehydrated, everything boxing here is showing us, it's a good Twitter account, it's one that tweets all the boxing news, he's showing us at the time that Conor Benn weighed in at over 170 pounds on the morning of the fight. So he even had more time at that point to rehydrate further potentially. So that is over a 20-pound weight cut that he did for that Dobson fight. All water weight, of course. Maybe a bit of food as well. So the crazy thing about this is, even though for the Dobson fight, he weighed in around 9 pounds lighter than he did for the second Eubank fight, on the second day weigh-in, he was actually heavier at the time of the Dobson fight. So this is quite mind-blowing to me. Now, you can only speculate as to why he decided to be lighter for the Eubank fight versus the Dobson fight. Perhaps he felt like his performance against Dobson wasn't great and actually he'd put on too much size for his frame. Perhaps against Eubank he wanted to prioritize speed and stamina a little bit more, so he felt being lighter would make more sense. But whichever way you look at it, he actually weighed more in the ring in the Dobson fight than he did in the Eubank Jr. fight, most likely. We don't have weights for when they were actually in the ring, unfortunately. But unless Conor Benn went and rehydrated absolutely loads after he weighed in the 167.25 for the Eubank fight, it's safe to say that he was lighter for this fight than he was against Dobson. And this leads us to the core question of this video, which is, and I want to speculate this, is Conor Benn actually already a welterweight? Is he a welterweight right now that just isn't cutting the full amount of weight that he would normally cut? Because look, for that Dobson fight, he's cut at least 20 pounds to be in the ring versus Dobson at 150.5. And what did he weigh against Eubank Jr. in the second fight? Let's remind ourselves, 167.25. So what's 167.25 minus 20 pounds? Roughly 20 pounds? 147. Bang on welterweight. There is an argument to be made that all he's been doing recently is just cutting less water weight. It's a genuine proposition that we should consider. Now look, there's another side to this argument about whether or not he should be heading back down to welterweight, which is that his body isn't used to cutting water. It's not used to cutting water weight. Well, I don't have the scientific answer to this, but I would speculate using logic and common sense. His body's not used to cutting water, but I don't think not doing it for long periods of time necessarily makes you worse at it per se. And surely less water cuts in your career is actually better for the body, I would imagine. I can't imagine that being in a rhythm of doing water cuts makes your body more accepting of them or better at them, although I could be wrong. If anybody knows the answer to that, make sure you get in the comments below. I suppose when we look back to those cautionary tales I gave you at the beginning, that there is something to be taken from them for Conor Benn, and that is around his age. He's 29 years old now. I think people think that he's younger than that because he's not had a really long pro career so far, or at least not loads of high-profile names. But he's only about a year or two younger than Kell Brook was when he did that cut, when he went up to Gennady Golovkin, then he brought himself back down to welterweight after that. Now, interestingly with Kell Brook, when he went up and fought Golovkin, and look, everybody's body is different, but for a comparison, when he went up and fought Golovkin, they had a check weight before the fight, and Brook weighed 167.8. He probably put on a bit more size for that when he got in the ring. He was probably in the 170s. Probably not a dissimilar size from Conor Benn when he fought Chris Eubank Jr. I suppose the only difference with Kell Brook's situation really was that he was always struggling to make welterweight. And I don't think he was as disciplined as Conor Benn is as a pro athlete. Kell Brook used to blow up in weight in between camps. And I think a large part of the reason he struggled with welterweight so much was his own discipline levels. But certainly when he went up to fight Golovkin, he looked absolutely massive, and I can't imagine that cut was very nice when he came back down, and we saw what happened to him. So the point is, we saw with Kell Brook a very similar situation, and it's definitely one that Conor Benn should take notes from if he is going to go back down to welterweight. And in some ways, Brooks was actually an easier transformation because he'd been fighting at welterweight consistently, and then in a 6-month period, he went from fighting at welterweight to fighting against Triple G, whereas for Conor Benn, it's literally been years since he made welterweight. So the questions around whether or not he's a welterweight anymore are valid, but when we really break down his weights, his sizes over the years, it gets quite murky. It's as I've shown you in this video, it's kind of unclear what he was weighing in the ring when he was fighting at welterweight. I'm really not sure. I don't know if he was doing such a severe water cut when he was fighting the likes of Chris Algieri and Chris Van Eerden, or if that's something he just did when he was up at 150. It's really quite confusing, and I suppose only Conor Benn will be able to answer that. But with how assertive he's been, that what he wants to do next is go and fight for that WBC welterweight title, with how confident Eddie Hearn's been in talking about him going back down to 147, it does seem like that's the thing that will happen next, and they do seem very confident that he's going to be alright, that he can make it happen. And perhaps that confidence is born out of the fact that he is already very close to being a welterweight at the moment. He may have to shave off a few pounds in muscle, but overall, he might actually be closer than we think. I suppose the interesting thing is, and this is a final point that I'll make about Conor Benn, is that a lot of people have been calling his performance against Chris Eubank Jr. world class. But the logical and obvious solution to all of this to me right now is just to go to 154 pounds. If this guy's world class, if you genuinely think he beat a bona fide good middleweight fighter in Chris Eubank Jr., you don't think he was just Skeletor in the ring, you don't think that the guy was drained to hell, why are you all so keen for him to go back down to 147 and skip 154? I mean, I know why it is. It's because the division's full of killers, guys that he would have a horrific time with in the ring. But to all the people that think he's world class now, to all the people that think he's absolutely brilliant and that he had a bona fide win over Chris Eubank Jr., tell me why you don't want him to fight at 154. I'd love to hear from you. Personally, I think he does have a decent chance of winning a world title if he gets himself back down to 147 in a good way, in a healthy way. The champions right now consist of Lewis Crocker, Rolly Romero, Mario Barrios, and Brian Norman Jr. That division's been pretty dead for a while, and it speaks to the quality of the champions that we've had in recent times. I think Lewis Crocker can consider himself quite lucky to be a welterweight champion because of the fights with Paddy Donovan. There was so much controversy surrounding them. Rolly Romero, he's not the best fighter I've ever seen. I also don't think it's a foregone conclusion that Conor Benn beats him. Brian Norman Jr. is about to fight Devin Haney, so that'll kind of sort that one out. And Mario Barrios recently had a draw against Manny Pacquiao, which tells you how good that guy is. I mean, he's also naturally quite small. He's ended up at 147. He's lost to the likes of Gervonta Davis before, who's a little guy. And I just don't think he's aggressive enough to maybe deal with Conor Benn. I think he would give Ben some things to think about, but ultimately, there's a reason that Conor Benn's calling for that WBC belt. I think Barrios probably is the easiest fight for him at welterweight. It's the most winnable. Not a foregone conclusion, but that's only because I'm not quite sure how good Conor Benn is. Conor Benn might be much better than Mario Barrios at this point, but I haven't learnt much from that win against Eubank Jr., and his welterweight career before that left much to be desired. So we will see. But look, you can see from this tweet here, Conor Benn is clearly a very wise and sympathetic man when it comes to weight cutting and getting your nutrition right. So I'm sure when it's all said and done, he'll do it safely, but also on reflection, he might understand the position that Chris Eubank Jr. was in their fight. He probably already does, to be fair though. Anyway, that's the last time I'm going to talk about it. But the long and short of it is, I do believe that he's not that far off being a welterweight already, and I think he will get back there with relative ease. But guys, let me know what you think in the comment section below. Do you think that Conor Benn will get back down to welterweight easily enough? Do you think he should stop off at 154 on the way? And let me know what you thought of this video. Thank you so much, as ever, for watching all the way to the end of this one, guys. I hope you've enjoyed it, and as I always say, on to the next one.